Thank you for joining us on Bees on the Law, legal talk from the boss perspective. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide legal advice and is not meant to create an attorney-client relationship. Also remember, laws change and differ from state to state, so this is not a substitute for seeking legal advice in your jurisdiction on the current law applicable to you. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Bees on the Law. This is going to be an exciting season. We're excited to be back. We took quite a bit of a hiatus, but we wanted to talk about some of the new laws around the United States. So we're going to not only focus on California and Illinois, we're going to give you a little taste of new laws to come in those two states, which are Susan's and my home states. But we're also going to talk about a few laws around the nation that we thought were interesting that haven't come up. And so to start, I'm going to let you start, Susan, and you pick your first law you want to talk about.
Well, I'll start with talking about Illinois, because similar to California, we've got quite a few new laws coming in, and I know that we're going to be doing more detailed podcasts to go through the new laws in our states. But the big change in employers in Illinois need to know about is the Paid Leave Act. It's called Paid Leave for All Workers in Illinois, which is a big change. It's one of only 3 states now in the country that require employers to give their employees paid leave for any reason or no reason at all. So that's been a big shift for many Illinois employers getting ready for that. Not to be outdone, the city of Chicago has just recently said, hey, we want to get on that bandwagon. And even though they already had in Chicago mandated sick leave, they've decided to add on top of that mandated paid leave as well. So if you're lucky enough to be a worker in Chicago, you could get up to 10 days paid leave, whereas the rest of the state, it's only 5. So that's going to be a big change here in Illinois. What about you, Camille?
So, well, California has expanded its sick leave and employers are required to give more sick leave, but you're going to have to tune in to the special California episode to hear the details on that one. But, you know, one of the more interesting laws, as we were looking at laws around the nation, is this new law in Arkansas that allows prospective employers, if an employee doesn't show, or a prospective employee doesn't show up for an interview, the employer can actually report that employee to the Division of Workforce Services, which I assume is the equivalent of the unemployment insurance in Arkansas, and that could disqualify that prospective employee if he doesn't or she doesn't show up for an interview from unemployment insurance. I thought that was a really one of the harsher stances that I've seen around the country.
Yeah, I agree. And it's really interesting to see a new law that's almost pro-employer. While that's, I don't know if people really consider that pro-employer, but the idea that, hey, you can't just, schedule the interview and then not show up, or we might be able to turn you in. Whereas around the country, the remainder of the laws really are more benefiting the employee. So continuing around the country, I think that Colorado has some interesting laws coming up. The one is one new law they have, the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act, is very familiar to those of us in California and Illinois because it's been here and in California even longer. But it's requiring employers to post all job and promotional opportunities with salary range. That was also enacted in Illinois, but isn't going into effect until 2025 here. But I know California, that's been around for a bit. But it also extends back pay recovery from 3 to 6 years for employees who think that there's pay discrimination. So that is an interesting law in and of itself, because it's just seeing a trend as it's rolling across the country towards this requiring salary ranges be included in job postings. But the one that I think is really interesting, it isn't specifically a employment law, but it will impact employees or employers, is that it's that Colorado is decriminalizing the use of certain psychedelic medicines and also other chemicals, for example, in what people refer to as, psychedelic mushrooms. Those are no longer being criminalized. And Colorado, being one of the leading states that led the wave to decriminalize marijuana, now decriminalizing another commonly used drug, mushrooms. It's going to be interesting to see how that might lead a new wave across the country. The law in Colorado, though, does state that employers can say you can't be on the substance while you're here working, but so it's not requiring you to allow your employees to show up, on mushrooms, but it is decriminalizing yet another drug. So we'll see what happens with that.
Yeah, and California has a couple new laws about cannabis use in the workplace. And so, I think those are going to be very interesting. As everybody knows, federal and state law conflict, and it's always very tricky for employers to test employees for cannabis use, whether they're under the influence at work or not. And it actually, in California, as of January 1, will be illegal for an employer to request information from a job applicant relating to prior use of cannabis. So I think that, California is definitely trying to make some laws surrounding that as well.
And that's similar to what's going on in Washington. Same things going on there. They are making it. You're not allowed. They're prohibiting the ability to ask about prior cannabis use off the job or away from the workplace, or unrelated to work. It's part of here in Illinois already, right? If you can't question employees about what they do when they're not working. You can only restrict what they do when they're working. And if cannabis is legal, then that includes cannabis. It goes back to needing to have those checklists for your employees to see if they are under any kind of influence, right? I think we have a previous podcast on it. I'll have to see if I can dig that up and repost that one or make that one. I think we did it quite a while ago. Just ways in which you can establish that your employees are under the influence. But yeah, Washington jumping on that bandwagon with you, California.
Yeah, and I noticed also as we were kind of reviewing some of these new laws around the country that there's a couple states, including Rhode Island, that have actually increased the penalties for wage and hour violations. And it looks like generally for misclassification. So I know, Susan, we talk a lot about, are you an employee? Are you exempt versus non-exempt? Are you an independent contractor? And it sounds like, I haven't read this law in detail, but it seems like a lot of states are cracking down on things that California has been very aggressively pursuing with respect to laws now, particularly as it pertains to labor.
Right. And the concept of criminal penalties, making it, I believe, a felony in certain circumstances. Very interesting that Rhode Island is taking such an intense stance on that position. So it'll be interesting to watch what goes on there, and if any other states kind of pick up that concept. For me, I was interested also in what's going on in Minnesota. Namely, a big reason was that Minnesota has, similar to what Illinois and Chicago are doing here, a new law called the Earned Sick and Safe Time Law, which I find interesting because Chicago's new law also talks about sick and safe time. So I'm wondering if this is going to be a trend of, instead of just calling it sick leave, if it's going to become a nationwide recognized term of sick and safe. But anyway, the law in Minnesota is very it's much more aggressive even than what's going on here in Illinois. Here in Illinois, it's 1 hour of paid time off for every 40 hours worked. in Chicago, it's actually every 35. In Minnesota, it's 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. So employees there can rack up to 48 hours each year of sick leave or leave to use for a sick family member. Whereas here in Illinois, we have it capped at 40 hours. So it's interesting to see Minnesota going even further beyond what many employers here in Illinois are already screaming about 40 hours, and Minnesota's going all the way up to 48. They also had some other interesting laws going on there. It was interesting to see Minnesota have so many new employment laws. They are prohibiting employment discrimination based on gender identity in Minnesota. So that was interesting. And then also they have a prohibition prohibiting employers from acquiring into previous pay history during the hiring process, something that's been here in Illinois for a while. So it's catching on.
Yeah. And so one of the big things that I'm going to go back to California for a second. If you've listened to this podcast, you know California doesn't like non-compete agreements except for in very specific circumstances. And California has passed a couple new laws that kind of solidifies that position even more. And, employers as of January 1 have to actually notify their employees if they entered into a non-compete that is now void. And they have to do that by February 14th. About why they pick Valentine's Day.
Well, that's interesting.
I always think there's some weird meeting in that date that when they pick Valentine's Day, but employers are going to have to do that by Valentine's Day. And that's a really big deal in companies that have non-competes and have traditionally tried at least to have non-competes. Now, not only are they void, but you have to tell your employee that it's void.
Wow. Yeah, that's and California's had that anti-non-compete stance for a very long time, much longer than other states that have been picking up on that more recently. So it's interesting that they're now taking even more of a hard line on that one as well.
Right. And so tune into the California edition of the new laws to hear some more details because there's a little bit more to those laws than we've talked about here. And of course, if you're concerned about new laws in your state, make sure you consult, an attorney to make sure you're in compliance, because obviously we don't practice in other states and can't give legal advice on the podcast.
Exactly. So there are other states that have new laws. We just kind of hit on a few interesting ones. So always, this is not a complete list, right? So always make sure you check and see if your state, if you're not in Illinois or California or Wisconsin, because I'm licensed there as well. If you're not in one of those states, make sure that you're checking in and making sure you're compliant with your new laws.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Bees on the Law. Thank you for joining us on today's podcast of Bees on the Law. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast. We also welcome any comments. If you'd like to get in touch with us or suggest a future topic, you can email us at beesonthelaw@gmail.com. And because we're lawyers, we need to remind you that this podcast is not meant to provide you with legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Thank you again for joining us and have a great day.